Okay, so let's talk about Julian Assange now. What's going on in the British court system is his final chance, his last appeal before British courts would allow his extradition to the United States. The US system has been trying to get a hold of Julian Assange for many, many years now. Arguably since 2010, when this amazing journalist's work, and we'll talk about some of his work here in a moment, led to the leaking and release of all kinds of official documents showing American crimes, American military crimes in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, as well as leaked cables that showed the levels of corruption that were being used by American officials abroad, the collateral murder videos that showed helicopters in Iraq literally gunning down journalists. And then, of course, later, Julian Assange released documentation about the DNC and how they had rigged the primary against Bernie Sanders. But in between, there were so many important releases through WikiLeaks and through Julian Assange that many people in many countries around the world think of their governments differently now than they would have without WikiLeaks and the work that Julian Assange did. This is why Julian Assange is our era's most important journalist. He's the Thomas Paine, or the Ida Tarbell, if you know of her work as a muckraker, or the Daniel Ellsberg of our era. His work innovating journalism for the 21st century is just unparalleled. He had the insight, or the people he was working with had the insight, to realize that in this increasingly information-driven age, that one of the few vulnerabilities that the establishment military order had was for official documents to be leaked that would reveal crimes at the government level. And so he's been doing that for years. And in Red, White, and Blind, I chronicle some 18 of the most important and crucial documents that were leaked by Julian Assange. And one can only wonder that in these years he's been in prison, what crimes we don't know about because WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have been behind bars. So we'll read through a few of these right now just to show you in Red, White, and Blind how important Julian Assange's work has been. The collateral murder footage mentioned above leaked by former Army intelligence officer Chelsea Manning. The footage shows U.S. soldiers in Apache military helicopters shooting and killing innocent Iraqi civilians in cold blood. Soldiers are seen laughing while doing this. Helicopters circle back around to kill journalists and medical responders at the scene. The videos reveal horrible, ugly truths about the illegal invasion, further crystallizing global opinion against the war. Tens of thousands of additional documents from the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan revealing murders of civilians and torture of detainees and prisoners, and the U.S. military's cover-up of these events. At least 66,000 civilian deaths were recorded in the documents, a number far larger than had previously been admitted. Documents revealing U.S. efforts to spy on foreign leaders and diplomats ranging from Chinese and German leaders to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Spying included obtaining credit card numbers, frequent flyer numbers, and other private information. Documents revealing UK government collusion with the CIA to develop software to hack consumer devices. One goal of the agency was to turn Samsung smart TVs into microphones to spy on citizens via computer virus in their set called Weeping Angel. Another goal was devising software that could hack into people's smartphones, computers, and cars to listen to conversations or obtain text messages or other data. Thousands of Israeli documents revealing that country's intention to keep the Palestinian territory of Gaza on the edge of collapse by depriving its people of a functioning economy, to handle Palestinian protests with increasing violence, and to launch a new war in Lebanon. Thousands of emails by a climate research team at the University of East Anglia in England revealing that world temperature data was manipulated to boost the appearance of climate change. This led to a significant scientific scandal just before a climate summit in Denmark. And those, my friends, are just a few of the many crucial things we've learned from the leaks produced by Julian Assange and his groundbreaking technology, the WikiLeaks website. I want to take a moment here to also step back and look at some of the grand proclamations people make, sometimes when talking about someone like Donald Trump, or when talking about war in Ukraine or war in Israel. People will say, well, the international order is at stake, or the rules-based international order is at stake, that the norms are at stake if this war isn't fought, or if Donald Trump becomes president or something like that. And the case of Julian Assange really shows the levels of hypocrisy that are present when we have mainstream media journalists saying things like that. It is Julian Assange, more than anyone else, who's the important character in this story. If we allow the United States government to extradite from Britain Julian Assange, who's not an American citizen and has never worked for an American corporation or lived in the United States, to extradite him to some court in Northern Virginia, where it'll just be the intelligence community and the military-industrial complex trying him, certainly convicting him to live out the rest of his days and most likely die quite soon in an American prison. If we allow that to happen, that threatens this quote-unquote rules-based international order more than anything else, because what that will do is that will criminalize investigative journalism. That will basically say that anywhere in the world, if you do investigative journalism that is not approved by the state, that is not approved by governments, you can then be extradited, tried on espionage charges in the United States, even if you're not an American citizen. And certainly if you're an American citizen, they could do the same thing as well. So this is why this case is so important. What is on trial with Julian Assange is the ability to do investigative journalistic work. Every investigative journalist works with confidential sources. Every investigative journalist looks to publish classified documents. This is as do the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian in London. Every big newspaper, every serious publication is interested in publishing confidential information if it shows wrongdoing by the government. This is why we have journalism. This is why the First Amendment to our Constitution guarantees the freedom to do this kind of work. And not just to journalists that have some kind of credentials, not journalists that the government says are journalists, or journalists that are paid a lot of money by some big corporation. No, every single person can do this. In the same way that the First Amendment guarantees the right for me or for you to speak your mind, whether you're criticizing this government or another government, that's the freedom of speech that you have. In the same way, the freedom of the press, that's also in the First Amendment, guarantees your right to publish that, to print that into books, to put that into newspapers, to put that on social media, to put that out on the internet. And so to say anyone, whether it's Julian Assange or me or you or anybody else that you might read, any other independent or mainstream journalist you might follow, to say that they're not allowed to talk with confidential sources. I mean, what Julian Assange did with Chelsea Manning is the same thing that any independent investigative journalist would do with any source you work with. If somebody comes to you as an investigative journalist and says, look, I have this information and it's important and it shows wrongdoing by this corporation or that government, what you're going to do as an investigative journalist is you're going to say, you're not just going to go print it and just publish it. You're going to say, okay, that's interesting. Let's look at this. And then you're going to say, okay, well, you've got 3/4 of the story here. Can you go get this other piece? Right? And that's what Julian Assange did with Chelsea Manning, because Chelsea Manning had that information, as did others. And the other thing you're going to do is you're going to make sure that that person, that source, is able to communicate with you securely so that you're not putting this person's freedom at risk. And then the final thing you're going to do is you're going to vet that information to make sure that when you release it, it doesn't immediately endanger any lives. And those are the things that Julian Assange did. And those are the things that journalists at the New York Times did when they released the Pentagon Papers that Daniel Ellsberg leaked in a previous generation in the 70s, if you followed that story. Crucial information, how we learned about the Vietnam War and many other parts of the government. So what the US government is trying to do in extraditing Julian Assange and trying him on espionage charges is they're trying to criminalize investigative journalism. They're trying to say that what he did with Chelsea Manning, which was just these 3 things, work with a confidential source to get the information that that person wants to release, ensure that they have a secure method of communication, and then vetting the information. This is one thing that they'll say often if you're just looking at mainstream media about Julian Assange. They're always painting him as this irresponsible, crazy, wacky guy who just leaked information willy-nilly. Who cares if it endangers people? In a MSNBC segment that I talk about in Red, White, and Blind, it's Claire McCaskill and Joe Scarborough are discussing Julian Assange, and they're saying, well, this isn't like Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, where he worked with the New York Times and he worked with the Washington Post to ensure that only, information that didn't endanger lives was released. That's exactly what Assange did. They'll say he didn't do that. That's literally exactly what he did. He looked to work with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Der Spiegel in Germany, the Guardian in London. Some of the newspapers, now they didn't choose to work with him, which is a different issue, but many of them did. And so that's when the information was leaked. That's how it was done. So be very clear about this. The reason the U.S. government wants to get Julian Assange has nothing to do with protecting the lives of soldiers or nothing to do with protecting your precious ears from misinformation or something like that. It's because he released embarrassing truths about corporations, about people in power, about the military-industrial complex, about the U.S. military, and about many private corporations, even about things like Scientology, the Conservative Party in Britain, what they had said about immigrants. A lot of things got released through WikiLeaks that were not the direct work of Julian Assange. In fact, most of it was not Julian Assange's work. But it's the platform he set up, WikiLeaks, that really is one of the most important, perhaps the most important journalistic institution and free speech that we have in the world today. And so that is the rules-based international order that we have to protect. Free speech, freedom of the press, freedom for science, freedom for democracy, these things to flourish. They need a free press in order for them to work. And this is why this case of Julian Assange, this is why this last chance of his before the British courts is so important. And if he gets extradited to the United States, it's probably curtains. So the hope is that that justice prevails here and he is allowed to stay he really needs to be set free. Right now he's staying in Belmarsh prison in the UK, which is considered the Guantanamo of the British system. It's where they lock up their highest security terrorists and people like that. There's really no reason for Julian Assange to be rotting away in this prison. The only thing he's ever been convicted of was skipping bail in the Ecuadorian embassy, which was because he was worried that he was going to be extradited. And so at this point, there was an 11-month sentence for that. At this point, he's served that many times over. The last thing I'll say on Julian Assange, and I encourage you to read more, and if you do, I think you'll find a really fascinating thing, and this is part of media consciousness and developing a balanced media diet, as we talk about here, is that you'll notice that it's a rare scenario in which the anti-establishment left media and the anti-establishment right media, so this is what we call in the balanced media diet true news as opposed to party news, they're in unison. It's rare that you see this. Both the anti-establishment right and anti-establishment left are very much in favor of Julian Assange, his freedom, and that what he's done has been crucial. It's the establishment, both the Republicans and the Democrats and the corporate media, they're all arrayed against Julian Assange, and all of the corporate media and the corporate politicians will say all of these negative things about him. And that's because they dislike him. They hate him. I mean, the mainstream corporate media journalists, they see him as not part of their club. He didn't go through corporate media, and he's out there, he's been breaking stories, way bigger stories, way more important stories, doing the real work of journalism more than they ever could. It's almost like a case of psychological projection or something where they want to put on him what is actually true about them, that they are the servants of power, that they are the servants of propaganda, and that they are the ones bringing out and disseminating disinformation and propaganda. So it'll be interesting. You should go and check out other sources, not just Red, White, and Blind here about Julian Assange, and I think you'll see uniformity across anti-establishment sources, independent media. And that really speaks to the importance and the power of Julian Assange.